Welcome to our deep dive into the upcoming Queensland election. Scheduled for Saturday the 26th, the election will be heavily influenced by trust and distrust, and a weird mix of wildcard politics like free school lunches, cut-price public transport and power bill subsidies. With consumer confidence still nudging recessionary territory, inflation stubbornly high, interest rates fueling concerns about mortgage stress and the ongoing cost of living crisis, we would expect to hear the US presidential campaign phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," dominating the political agenda. But we live in strange and uncertain times when normal economic and social agendas just don't seem to behave as expected. So we need to go under the surface and look at the role of trust and distrust in the election outcome. In 21st century politics, it's typically hard to win, even if a candidate is trusted. But if they're distrusted, winning becomes an impossible goal. As Obama famously said, all else is lost if people cannot trust their government. If a political leader has trust, they can offer a compelling vision for the future. Without trust, they can only run a fear-based campaign, exploiting voter anxieties to rally their base. But trust is a fragile asset. As an old Dutch saying puts it, trust comes on foot, but leaves on horseback. This means that trust is slow to build, but can be lost in a heartbeat or a hoofbeat. If trust is the foundation of all human connections, as it is, then distrust is where our deepest fears, pain, and feelings of betrayal surface. Roy Morgan's data on distrust since 2017, along with our own lived experience, reveals that distrust can destroy a brand's or a political leader's reputation overnight. Take Woolworths as a recent example. After years as Australia's most trusted brand, it plummeted 194 places in June, becoming the nation's 5th most distrusted brand. This decline highlights the material impact of distrust, an erosion of public confidence that can undo years of brand equity in a matter of months. Distrust destroys. Social and political trust is fragile. It doesn't take much to trigger a chain reaction of scepticism that sends society spiralling downward. Triggering the base can have devastating effects. Look at the January 6, 2021 storming of the US Capitol. Those individuals acted out of deep-seated distrust of governmental institutions. Their actions didn't just expose existing fractures, they intensified political fragility and accelerated national division at a critical moment for democracy. We don't want to be a society consumed by distrust. As we approach upcoming elections, we must recognise how distrust can undermine the very foundations of our democracy. Our future depends on it. So how do we measure trust and distrust? Well, we're Roy Morgan, so we conduct a survey, a continuous survey. For 7 years, we've been asking more than 2,000 Australians each and every month which brands they trust and which brands they distrust. That's more than 24,000 respondents each year. We also ask them why they trust or distrust their nominated brands, and we record exactly what they say in their own words. This research is open-ended and completely unprompted. That means for people who nominate a brand, it's so top of mind that they put it ahead of all the other brands swirling around in their consciousness. So let's start with what trust and distrust are doing to politics and government in Australia. Across the board, governments and their departments are consistently distrusted by Australians. The green columns represent trust and the red columns represent distrust. As you can see, this chart has way more red than green. The black line represents net distrust, calculated by subtracting distrust from trust scores. So this data reveals that government services are more distrusted now than at any other time in the past 5 years. Following the election of the Albanese Labor government, Trust increased slightly, but distrust increased more, pulling the net distrust score down to new lows. Now imagine if, like everyone else, Roy Morgan only looked at trust. We'd have a positive story of reasonably steady trust over the last 5 years. But when we add distrust, which no one else measures, the entire setting changes dramatically. When we then add a yellow net distrust line, we see that Queenslanders distrust the system of government more than anyone else. Interestingly, net distrust by Queenslanders in governments and government services reached its lowest point in the dying days of the Morrison coalition government, and it improved immediately the Albanese government won office. It's since declined again, but remains marginally better than under the coalition. Now, while this measure of government and government services specifically excludes political parties, it reveals a Queensland electorate that's less trusting and more distrusting of the institution of government than the rest of Australia. Let's now examine the role of trust and distrust and what role they play in the upcoming Queensland election. The first question, of course, is who do Queenslanders trust more, Premier Stephen Miles or Opposition Leader David Crisafulli? And the answer is, well, it's a little hard to tell. When we asked Queenslanders this question, thinking about the Queensland election, who do you trust and who do you distrust, almost no one mentioned either of the leaders. In fact, 89% of respondents failed to mention either of them. Only 7.3% mentioned Stephen Miles and a tiny 3.8% mentioned David Crisafulli. Of the small proportion of respondents who in our unprompted survey brought either of them to mind, more say they trust Premier Miles than Opposition Leader Crisafulli. Premier Stephen Miles is twice as distrusted, though, as his LNP opponent. Subtracting distrust from trust, which we do, gives both candidates a net distrust score, minus 0.5%. That means they're both more distrusted than trusted. They both need to increase their visibility and transform voter perceptions from distrust to trust. Even with such a short time until the election, focusing on these goals can be decisive when voter persuasion is so important. So how do the leaders' trust and distrust translate onto their political parties? First, let's analyse trust. The ALP's trust score is slightly lower than the LNP's, so on trust alone, the LNP has an edge over Labor. This is important because trust scores are a good indicator of voting intentions. Voters are more likely to support parties and candidates they trust. We saw it federally and again in the Victorian election. And while trust scores provide a snapshot of voter sentiment towards each party, the flow of preferences may also significantly impact the final election results. So why do Queenslanders trust the LNP? In their own words, respondents who trust the LNP do so because it will crack down on crime, particularly youth crime. It'll avoid Labor's smug attitude, it'll be more common sense than Labor, and have a better sense of what's right for Queensland. Several also simply want to avoid Labor's so-called woke attitude. Using data science and AI coding to roll up all respondents' reasons for trusting the LNP into themes, the number one reason with a score of 23.7% is because it's better than the ALP or the Greens. The remaining four reasons are relatively minor, all with less than 7%. They range from no reason not to trust them, doing a good job, good leadership, with only 6%, and doing the right thing, with just 4.7%. So what about trust for Labor? Respondents who trust the ALP do so because it's better at managing the economy, they say, and looks after everyone, not just the wealthy. Some respondents had a bad experience with the LNP and worry that the LNP won't look after workers. Aggregating the individual verbatims into themes, Queenslanders trust Labor because it's better than the other parties, the same as the LNP's top reason. Good track record comes in second, followed by ethical, doing a good job, and keeping promises. Now let's turn our attention to distrust. Understanding that trust is valuable and that distrust is toxic highlights the asymmetrical nature of sentiment in politics. While a lack of trust means neutrality or indifference, distrust activates negative emotions like fear and anxiety, significantly influencing voter behaviour and even election outcomes. With more than a third of respondents distrusting the ALP, it faces substantial negative sentiment in the upcoming election. That said, the LNP's distrust is not far behind at 32.1%. So why do Queenslanders distrust the LNP? Respondents' reasons for distrusting the LNP range from, and I quote, "They did a terrible job last time," to a lack of climate and environmental concerns and criticism of their so-called rubbish on youth crime. And when we roll those individual verbatims up into the overall themes, the number one reason Queenslanders distrust the LNP is that they're dishonest and liars. Next is self-interested, unethical, unfriendly to the environment and untrustworthy. So that's the opposition party. But what about the Labor Party? Queenslanders distrust the ALP for reasons ranging from its failure to act during its government tenure, allowing youth crime to get out of control, and not acting in the public interest. When individual reasons are rolled up into themes, there's no real difference between the LNP and the ALP. The key difference is that 27.1% of Labor distrusters, compared with only 19.9% of LNP distrusters, give dishonesty and lying as their top reason for distrusting the party. So those are the two majors, but what about reasons why voters distrust the Greens? And remember, Greens' preferences may be pivotal come the election day. Respondents said they distrust the Greens because they don't seem to know what they stand for anymore, with policies that conflict with the broader Green movement and the federal Greens. They feel the Greens make unrealistic promises and tell people to do things like steal to survive, and they should stick to environmental issues instead of getting into areas like housing. There's a real sense of invective and even hostility in these comments, showing more intense feelings of distrust than for the two major parties. In summary, the net trust scores reveal that all three major parties have significant levels of distrust among voters. The ALP, minus 16.8, the LNP, minus 12.1, and the Greens, minus 12.9. On the other hand, One Nation has a positive net trust score of plus 1.7, making them the only party more trusted than distrusted. This indicates that voters are largely disillusioned with the major parties and may be turning towards smaller parties like One Nation. We also asked Queenslanders what would worry them if the ALP were re-elected. Many felt that crime rates would increase due to the ALP's perceived soft stance on crime, especially youth offences. Others fear worsening healthcare with longer hospital wait times and ongoing issues like ambulance ramping. Concerns also include wasteful government spending, poor leadership, inadequate infrastructure planning, and too much focus on South East Queensland. Teacher shortages were also mentioned, as were employment issues and negative impacts from green policies. Combining and ranking these individual responses, 16.4% of people said nothing would worry them. They'd be happy if the ALP were re-elected. Next, crime and law and order, followed by, and I quote, "everything would worry me." The final two were cost of living and financial mismanagement. So what worries Queenslanders about the election of a Crisafulli state government? Voters are worried that the LNP won't offer practical solutions to Queensland's problems and that it hasn't shared clear policies. They feel the LNP doesn't care about struggling families or low-income earners and that it lacks empathy for those who need help. There are also concerns about increased youth incarceration, going backwards on renewable energy, stopping the treaty process and denying Indigenous rights. When we aggregate them, people's biggest concerns about the LNP winning was similar to concerns about the ALP being re-elected. The major difference was that 22.6 said nothing would worry them if the LNP won, compared with, remember, 16.2% that said the same about the ALP. Interestingly, what's missing from this LNP worry list is any mention of crime or law and order. Perhaps voters believe the LNP would do a better job than the ALP on crime and law and order. In conclusion, the wildcards. I always ask if there's a wildcard in any election. This Queensland election is playing out in a trust vacuum. The wildcards won't be the positives, like free lunches, subsidised transport and power bills. The wildcards will be fear and anxiety-led. Women and the threat to abortion laws. Children and incarceration. And finally, that positive net score for One Nation. That positive score plus 1.7 points to a wildcard that could disrupt the expected outcome on election day. With all three major parties experiencing significant levels of distrust, voters may well turn to independents or smaller parties that they see as more trustworthy. This shift could lead to unexpected results in key electorates, potentially impacting the overall balance of power. So yes, the rising trust in independents presents a wildcard that could be the big preference disruptor on election day. And that's a wrap. For a deeper dive into the leaders and parties, ask Roy Morgan or contact Julian McCrann. And why don't you subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest voting intentions and a range of Roy Morgan facts. For now, thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again in the future.